Good afternoon, everybody. This is Stephane Michaud from Korn Ferry, and welcome to this very exclusive and first ever webinar between Korn Ferry and IMD. So today we're going to talk about the cost optimization, right? Optimizing costs while investing for the future of your company and Indonesia. So of course we want to optimize costs, but we want to do this intelligently. And I think all of us, including Korn Ferry, this is a question, this is an important question. This is a struggle that we have to face, not only for our company, but for the country as well. Next. So a few housekeeping rules today. So all the lines are muted, therefore, but not because they're not all muted that you cannot interact with us. Please do raise your hands. Do use the chat function, and also the second point, the Q&A, right? So submit your questions through the Q&A box at any time during this session. We commit to answer all of your questions. If we don't answer your questions during this session, we commit to answering all of your questions eventually. So please do, since this session is recorded, and therefore nothing will be lost. Okay. Third point is, please give us the feedback on this session. Toward the end, we will have the opportunity. You will have the opportunity to do so, and we will share the slides and recording with you after the session. Right. Next. So, what are we talking about today? Right. Well, what we're talking about today, simple and complicated at the same time. So, the first one is we want to build a business case for sustainable cost optimization, sustainable being the key word. Second is how to take care of the bottom line without harming the top line. Yeah, a lot of companies will do, and this is the same mistakes every crisis. There's a lot of companies that are cutting the fat, not only the fat, but the muscles as well, and they're harming the top line and their capacity to increase their sales later on. Also, we will cover how to best position our organization, your organization, for the rebound, right? So who do we have today? Well, you're in luck, because we have assembled the two best speakers that we could ever think about for this topic. The first one is Dr. Jean-François Manzoni, who's the IMD president. He's a global leadership and organizational expert, and he's a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review, Financial Times, frequently goes to World Economic Forum and contributes there as well. He's a board member of several prominent organizations that have included and are including Keppel, Singapore Civil Service College, for example, and others. And finally, not last but not least, he's graduated from HSA and McGill in Montreal. He's a fellow Canadian, and so I'm a Canadian. We also have Mr. Sylvano Damanik, Vice Chairman of Korn Ferry in Indonesia. He previously was Managing Director of Hay Group Indonesia. He's been there for over 25 years. He was the reward practice leader for Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa. He's a legend in people consulting in the Indonesian market, and he's an expert in organization restructuring. Okay. Finally, you have myself, French Canadian, leading the LD practice in Indonesia, the leadership development practice in Indonesia. I was the APAC head of the HROD Center of Excellence for Mitsubishi Corporation in the past, and I've worked in the 5 continents. I'm looking forward to have you contribute to the max and to get the most out of this session. This session should be very exciting and very insightful indeed. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the baton to my good friend, Dr. Jean-François Manzoni.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to have this one slide that our Korn Ferry colleagues actually prepared for me. And then I'll ask them to stop sharing so that you can focus on me as we talk, because I think that that'll be helpful. So very, very briefly, IMD, who are we? We are an independent business school with Swiss roots and global reach. Now, this global reach is particularly in Asia, facilitated by our Singapore-based team, which is headed by my colleague, Professor Michek Piskorski, who is present on this call. We think of ourselves as a hybrid, combining on one side the best of academia. We are an academic institution, but also with a closeness to practice that is more traditionally characteristics of professional service firms. And one of the reasons why we are this hybrid is because our degree activities only account for 20% of what we do. So 80% of our activities involve executives and organizations. And as you can see on this slide, indeed, we have been very fortunate that in the FT global ranking of executive education providers, we have been in the top 3 for 9 consecutive years, and actually in the top 5 for 17 consecutive years. All right, so independent business school combining the best of academia and professional service firms. We focus on principles rather than practices, because practices are very context specific. Principles travel better. And so our hope is to drive to simplify or to get to core concepts so that then you, the executives, can help solve your own problems. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. So and if you can stop sharing now so that people can focus on me and what I'm saying. We are focusing today on optimizing costs. I would want to suggest to you that, again, if I take a step back, I think you ought to have 2 goals as you're facing this crisis. First, of course, to survive this crisis. Some organizations will not manage to do that, right? They will run out of cash. And in a crisis, liquidity is critical. Some companies will run out. So clearly surviving the crisis is a key objective. But I would suggest to you that it's not enough. You could survive this crisis, but enter then in a long period of kind of mediocrity and slow death. And so your second objective should be to not only survive the crisis, but come out of it a stronger organization, prepared to thrive in the post-crisis world. Now, why is this a separate goal? You know, how could you survive and not thrive? Well, for one of 2 reasons. The first one is, and Stephane already hinted at this, you could cut in order to survive in a way that handicaps you later on, because you've cut capacity, and when the business returns, you have to rehire or recreate that capacity, or you've lost capabilities, or you've lost connection with customers. You were so busy cutting and cutting that you lost your connection to customers, or you underinvested in innovation. We saw this in the last major crisis, right? And I remember particularly coming to Singapore, because I then lived in Singapore for 5 years, coming to Singapore in 2009, and Europe was still dying and cutting, and Singapore was already thriving. And I think one of the reasons was that the government encouraged companies not to cut as much, which meant that they managed to survive in a way that did not handicap the future. So one, cutting in a way that does not handicap the future later on. 2, you could survive but not thrive later on because you failed to make moves that will enable you to succeed in this post-crisis world. The post-crisis world will be different in some ways. And again, those ways are going to be different for every industry. In our industry, for example, we know that post-crisis, we will be doing more interactions in a way that is technology mediated than we were doing before the crisis. So the post-crisis world will be different and will require a different way of competing. And if you don't prepare for this, you may survive but not thrive. So I'm going to advocate for a combination of smart defense and selected offense, right? So balancing defense and offense. Now, when we talk about playing defense, clearly one aspect is going to be to reduce costs. I'm going to talk about this in a second. The other aspect, I think for a number of organizations, certainly for us, has been let's also line up financing and various kinds of support, including government support. I think this is important because otherwise all your efforts are relying on cost reduction as opposed to, again, how can I create flexibility for myself through intelligent calling on financing and supporters. So having said that, let me set aside this issue of financing and support and focus on the costs. So when I work with CEOs, and I've been doing this for, I guess by now, a number of decades, one of the things that CEOs often think of is they say, look, what we're going to do is we're going to make people go away, because that's clearly one way of reducing costs. And generally, when you make people go away, they adapt their work pace and their processes, and the work also goes away. I think that is true to some extent, but only. So I think that when we think of reducing costs, if we want to reduce costs in a way that is not going to simply push the ball a little bit further out, and the cost will come back very quickly, you've got to reduce complexity. So when I think of reducing cost, again, from a principle point of view, I think, how do I reduce complexity? Complexity in terms of processes, complexity in terms of activities. Activities can be products and services, can be divisions. Here, a key question is, are we doing too many things? Are there things that, if I look at it from an 80-20 point of view, basically it's a lot of effort for not a lot of results today or not a lot of results tomorrow? The crisis does provide you with some legitimacy to make more substantial moves than you would have normally made. So it is possible for you to say, let me use this crisis to reduce complexity, and from there, obviously, reduce my costs, including my manpower costs. Now, again, as Stephane said, I think you need to be mindful of the potential long-term costs in terms of foregone revenues or lost momentum. So maybe one way of thinking about this is to say, let me order various kinds of initiatives and actions in order of increasing long-term costs. So if we do this and that, this is really good. It reduces cost in the short run, and there's no negative impact in the long run. Then maybe we have somewhere we have some short-term reduction of cost, but some potential long-term costs not clear, and if so, limited. And then we have, again, one more layer where we look at this and we say, this we only want to do if really there is no other possibility to survive. So I think it is helpful to force yourself and your teams to think about various layers of costs, of cuts, and to think of them in terms of the long-term implications. By the way, one last important point on this issue, really an encouragement to involve your teams in the identification of ways to reduce costs. Too often, top management teams do this by themselves, and then you're kind of the only ones working. Research shows that there is an expression that you may have heard in America. It's called turkeys don't vote for Thanksgiving, because at Thanksgiving, Americans eat turkeys. And so the argument is people do not support decisions that end up being negative for them. That's actually not true. We find that when management teams respect fair process, we find that turkeys do vote for Thanksgiving. So a strong encouragement to involve your teams in identifying ways to reduce costs. Now that was the playing defense. Playing offense, I want to suggest playing offense, two key fronts. The first one, what will the future look like from a competitive point of view? This crisis is going to be with us for a while. And by the way, it will not end 0-1 one day. It will hopefully taper off. But at some point, we will make it through. We always do, right? The world does make it through crises. How will competition differ then? In terms of the basis of competition or in terms of the intensity of competition? So what investments do you need to make now to prepare for this future? In terms of technology, again, if I take our own example, over the last 3 months, we have cut costs. By the way, in a way, that we felt, and I'm going to come back on this, is helping to make the organization stronger. But we did cut expenses, but we also made investments in technology because we felt that that was an important part of surviving, yes, but also prospering in the future. So technology, processes, what investments do you need to make in terms of capabilities? What investments do you need to make in terms of customer goodwill? People remember how we behave toward them in times of crisis. Are you standing by your key customers? Are you helping them? Are you being generous? Merger and acquisition. Is there a competitor that is currently suffering and you can take advantage of their weakness? So key question here, what investments do you need to make to prepare now for the post-crisis world? Two, on the organizational front, can you use this crisis to build a stronger organization by reinforcing the sense of community, of shared destiny, by reinforcing the sense of identity, who we are as an organization, and by reinforcing the sense of purpose, what we stand for, why we exist. Again, it is very easy during crises to become very defensive and to forget the bigger picture and the purpose that your organization is pursuing over and above, obviously, financial performance. So I'm advocating a mix of offense and defense. Now, this mix will be different across industries. Right now, and Korn Ferry is going to show you some statistics on this, some industries are really in the business of surviving. And so they have a hard time thinking about the future. So maybe their balance will be 85-15 or 90-10. Then within industries, some companies will be able to play more offense than others. And then within company across time, probably at the beginning of the crisis, we think more of defense, but as time passes, we need to think more about playing offense. I think the key point here is that smart defense helps you to survive without handicapping your future. So you can cut complexity to cut costs in ways that won't make the cost come back too quickly in the future, and also don't reduce your future revenues. And then selected offense helps you to create tailwinds in the post-crisis world. One more point. How do you play offense and defense at the same time? Well, one of the key enabling conditions is going to be a top management team that performs really well. And that means a top management team that is aligned and engaged. So one of the things that I encourage you to think about as you're looking at these issues of cost optimization is, are you maintaining your top team in peak condition, not only physical condition, but also in terms of engagement and alignment? And in particular, we've observed two kind of major pitfalls that top management teams face in those times. The first one is decision-making. Decision-making needs to be data-based, right? Because otherwise it's erratic. And that's clearly one temptation for management teams. Complexity is scary, uncertainty is scary. And so one temptation is to look for simplicity and be drastic and excessive. So you don't want to do that. You want to remain data-based and you want to remain calm. Now, at the other extreme, you can become so data-based that you say, well, but we don't yet have the data in a conclusive sort of way. So those are two extreme. Here, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as the idiom goes. So it's search for simplicity that becomes simplistic. And here, it's paralysis by analysis. In a crisis, top management teams rarely have conclusive evidence. So you must be okay with making a decision based on convincing evidence. And also, sometimes you need to be able to change your mind very quickly. Very modest example, I was in a board meeting with my own board at IMD. On Thursday, I explained to them that we did not anticipate suspending face-to-face program for a while because the conditions needed to suspend face-to-face were 1, 2, 3, 4. The following morning at 8:30, the board meeting resumed. And I explained to my board that some of these conditions were now met and we were suspending face-to-face program. And this happened within 24 hours. So sometimes in a crisis, you need to be willing and able to change your mind quickly, which means that when you communicate, you need to always leave this possibility of revision. So decision-making, key challenge for top management teams. Second challenge, stay focused on precious few initiatives. Again, as a management team, you will see two temptations. One is not enough movement because the leadership teams and or the layers below are experiencing a sense of helplessness, a sense of hopelessness, and people become paralyzed and not enough happens. In other organizations, it's the opposite. Everybody's running around super busy, showing that they're doing things. And here you're losing traction because you're losing focus. More than 20 years ago, Steve Jobs gave us a wonderful quote. He said, people think that focus means saying yes to something. That's not what focus means. Focus means saying no to 100 other things. And then later on, he said, innovation means saying no to a lot of other things. So yes, during a crisis, we need to experiment, and we need to experiment because that's part of playing offense. But we also need to experiment in a way which is disciplined enough. You want to have a few initiatives and be very forceful in your implementation. Voilà. So a mix of intelligent defense and selected offense, and a top management team that is able to make decisions in the right way and then focus on a few key initiatives. Those are some of the principles that I wanted to share with you. Now, if our colleagues from Korn Ferry can, I think they have a slide called Q&A. Are there some questions that you might want to ask now?
So please, please participants, if you have questions, you can share in the Q&A tab or in the chat function. You can raise your hands. I'm sure we have many questions for Professor Manzoni.
Well, if we don't have them now, Stephane, one alternative is people will be typing them in over the next few minutes. And maybe we switch to Sylvano immediately, because I think this is probably also giving folks a time to type things in. Again, I'm happy to wait, or we just shift to Sylvano.
What we do.
I have one question. So the one question that just come in, what tips do you have to balance this intelligent defense and selected offense?
So the answer again is going to differ across industries, across companies, and across time. So if I want to give one key tip, it would be to be mindful of playing offense. Because the playing defense, everybody's going to be on you to play defense, right? Your board is going to be on you. Your bank is going to be on you. So playing defense is a natural inclination. One of my colleagues called Bala Chakravarti used to have a very, very nice sentence. He said, care for the unchosen. So always care for the non-natural, for the unchosen course of action. In a crisis, the natural course of action that you're going to be led to think about is playing defense. So make time in your agenda and in the agenda of the top management team, make time to think about how do we play offense. And maybe one starting point would be to ask yourself, okay, now we've spent a bit of time on how do we survive. Now let's spend some time on how will the world post-crisis look like? How will it be different from today? And what does this require from us? So again, one, you got to make time. And two, the key questions are, A, as I said, how will the world look like? And how will it be different? And what does this require us to do in order to prepare ourselves for this? The second question that you might want to ask yourself as you go through your defense is, am I reinforcing today the sense of shared community, shared identity, and shared purpose? Because I think that is a cornerstone of you being able to thrive in the future. It's to continue to involve your staff and your management teams in a way that creates hope and also maintains them in an engaged state. In a crisis, people have a tendency to freeze. That's because the human mind is geared to identify threats, and then it triggers a fight or flight response. So you want to keep your people productively engaged, and that's one of the things that you can ask yourself to remind yourself of playing offense. How am I keeping my people engaged, and how am I creating this sense of shared identity, shared purpose?
Excellent. That's a good segue to the second question, Professor Manzoni. So how do you encourage your leaders who are afraid of getting involved in offense? How do you deal with your leaders that are afraid?
So this is a fantastic question. And I'm going to make a confession. I could have done a better job of this on my own team. Here is what happens. There's a crisis, you step up. Because you're the CEO, you step up. Some members of your team step up. And you're looking at those and you're thinking, wow, that's great, I'm lucky. And then some members of your team don't step up and wither away. And they do that because, again, some of us thrive in these conditions, but a number of us do not, because of the fear of being incompetent, the fear of having lost what we had before. There's a lot of grief during crises. Especially during this crisis, we've lost a lot. We've lost the ability to go see whoever we want, whenever we want. We can't travel anymore. We're stuck at home with family. We love our family, but maybe not that much. So people have lost a lot. And there's a sense of grief. And now on your management team, you have some people who wither away. And maybe some of you have already reached Buddha nature and it doesn't annoy you. I got to tell you, most of the CEOs I know, it annoys them. And then you get frustrated with those team members. And as you get frustrated, two tendencies. One is you berate them, meaning, why aren't you doing this? And the other one is you disconnect. I did that one. And I only realized it as I was preparing some videos for CEOs, and I thought, so the key thing here is do not disconnect from the team members who are more anxious and have a tendency to play more defense. Encourage them, connect with them. You see, it is really counterintuitive, right? Because again, we either want to berate them or we want to disconnect from them. Instead, my encouragement is connect with them more. Create for them the sense of psychological safety, which is required for them to be able to think about playing offense. You see, the reason they're not thinking of offense is because they're too scared. So try to help them deal with the fear, starting with the sense of connection with you. Counterintuitive and not easy, but really important.
Thank you very much. And so we'll perhaps have one more question. So perhaps have one more question, and then we'll move on to the next one. So one more question here. What type of industry do you think are good for investment in the future for playing offense strategy? Wow, so some investment tips here.
So I don't do investment strategy. I think as a general rule, what I would think of as a CEO is I would think of how do I take this organization and help it to thrive in the future. Now, then if you're looking, further out into the future and saying, where do I want to invest my money? I'm afraid that I'm just a professor of leadership and organizational development, and this is above my pay grade. So I'm going to punt on this one. I will say that I think that in every industry, there are some possibilities of playing offense. Again, one of my board members is the chairman of an airline. Right now in the airline, it's really, really hard.
Yes.
But again, I think that there is a way of thinking of the future, and I see some airlines at least staying in touch with customers better than others, and also staying in touch with their staff better than others. So I will definitely agree that some industries have greater potential for playing offense, but I will also agree that in every industry, it is possible, at least to some extent, and I think necessary.
And on these words of wisdom, thank you very much, Professor Manzoni. And we'll transition to my good friend and colleague, Pa Sylvano. So please, Pandya, will you bring up the slides?
Thank you, Stephane. I think that's very compelling what Dr. Manzoni presented, and I will certainly remember your quote that smart defense, selective offense. And I also like the phrase that Stephane used, you can cut fat, but avoid cutting muscles. Because cost optimization is not only cutting cost, but how do you optimize cost that you still employ? Good. Just a quick intro, a few seconds about Korn Ferry. We are a global management consulting firm. We have several what we call the area of practices, starting from the organization strategy, assessment and succession, talent succession, leadership development, rewards, benefit. And in all countries, including Indonesia, we have those areas. And in fact, Stephane introduced himself as he's the leader of the leadership development part of Korn Ferry Indonesia. Okay. When probably it's safe to say, or I would like to say, probably since the Second World War, this is probably the only crisis that almost every nation, every people in the planet feel that they have a common enemy. The only difference is we don't see them because it's under the microscope. It's the only way you can look at this virus. When we did the survey in March, I think the response from the market was, are you going to be impacted? Yes, most of them feels impacted, but probably around 1/3 of the population feels that it's going to be impacting them moderately. You know, the difference between Indonesia and global. And we can share the slides later on, but what a difference a month can make. So Pandya, if you go to the next slide. This was done in April, a month after we take the, in fact, less than a month, and we took the results. And the global data that we had was many of the industries were hit by the pandemic. Dr. Manzoni already mentioned about the airline industry, travel, and so on and so forth. Are there sectors that are growing in this kind of situation? I'm sure there is, and I feel we have seen some, like, for example, online buying may be increased at the expense of people going to the malls. So I think in general, the issue is we know that we are going to be hit by a lot of things, and do we cut costs, and what to cost, and how to cut the costs? Bearing in mind, like what Dr. Manzoni said, that when you do selective offense, one thing that we need to bear in mind is innovation often comes from crisis situation. So I've seen, for example, businesses coming up with new products because it was not expected before. So maybe the other part of a smart offense is really understanding what would be the new normal would look like Dr. Manzoni said. What would be the competition would look like in the new normal? And perhaps with that, we can find a niche of our new products to enter the market. So if you go to the next slide, Pandya, some of the scenarios that we can do to cut, and I think we should not forget about two things. First is the duration of how long we think that this pandemic will affect us. Because I think the bigger issue is not how long will this pandemic will last, but how long does it take for our economy to rebound after the pandemic. So one axis is understanding the timeline or the duration of how long this will affect us and to bounce back. The second aspect is how deep do you think that this crisis will affect us, company to company, industry by industry? So you can have series of actions, but if you are forced to do a quick cut that can give you an immediate impact to your cash flow, probably you can pick some low-hanging fruits like any kind of spending on vendors, canceling events, travels. A lot of meetings are now done and it's already being done through virtual. So I think that's one quick wins or low-hanging fruits that we can get. But as you go, based on the scenario that this rebound will take longer than, let's say, 1.5 years, the question is, should we sacrifice our capex or capital investment? And if we do, what would be the cut that we need to do in our capex? Bearing in mind that if we can identify what would be the new normal like, perhaps the investment that may strengthen us in the new normal, if we can avoid to be cut, but we may reduce the capital investment on things that may be contributing to the business as usual after the new normal, let's say. So these are some of the actions that you can take either in short term, mid term, or slightly over a year, if you know that that your business is going to be affected longer than other. And if you go to the next slide, Pandya, if you are going to do several thrust or batches of cost-cutting tactics, some would be on timing issue. Some probably can also be on the variable expenses that you can cut. And then beyond, let's say, 4 to 5 months, if you go to click down, Pandya, the second wave is if you're already spending a lot of cost on employment. I'm approaching this from an employment cost angle. It's a fixed cost part of the business. But the question is, can we optimize from all the spending in employment that we are going to spend anyway? So for example, I'm sure it's easy to say that from all the 100% employment cost that we have spent, perhaps a few items may not be valued by the employees. And if it is not valued, it is not giving the impact that you want. So therefore, for those kind of cost items, perhaps you can cut that in the upfront. For example, if you're an organization with a young population, you may feel that probably the employees will prefer cash rather than benefits in kind, perhaps. So if you're an organization with lavish or very good benefits in kind, but not appreciated or not felt or seen by the employees, might as well reconstruct that cost element into something that can be felt by employees. Or vice versa, if you have an older generation or aging population in the organization, and there is a lot of cash element that may not be perceived important by the employees, there's also some low-hanging fruits that you can cut out from that. The other thing, if you look at the still in wave 2, if you look at the tackling process efficiency, that's really saying, looking at the process today, look at your processes today, see whether there are redundancies, because process will create jobs, jobs will make, you have to employ people, and that's cost. And it's probably safe to say that in my experience at least, if you have to reduce 5% of your employment costs, not saying about retrenchment, but just saving cost from the existing work that you do based on the business process that you use, 5% saving is a no-brainer. You can save a lot of cost, up to 5% from the existing processes without really doing a headcount cut. But obviously, if you have to do a major cost cut up to, let's say, 30%, you cannot do it without relooking at the business process or operating model. But at least even without crisis, organizations are always faced with the question, can we streamline our processes? So in a way, this is also, a blessing in disguise, that crisis gives us the reason to relook at these things, which we have not been able to do in quote unquote good times. Okay. And then obviously comes wave three. Wave three is more of fundamental cutting that you have to do, or restructuring that you have to do. I don't like the word layoffs. I don't like to use the word retrenchment, because it is not easy to sell. However, in some cases, it's a reality that we have to face. And especially in Indonesia case, it's not easy because we have been advised not to lay off if we can. But sometimes, again, it gives you an opportunity to find that extra fat that you can live without. But not using Stephane's word, don't cut too deep that you cut the tissue or the muscle, which prohibit you to bounce back immediately when the economy bounces back. Okay. So these are just some of the actions that you can do. If you go to the next slide, Pandya, I think we can just skip this because we've talked about this a bit. The other thing that we have heard from our clients, in fact, even within Korn Ferry itself, first of all, this crisis actually makes us more closer, more connected. I know some companies do a morning check-in, afternoon check-out every day. Now, before the crisis, I probably rarely see my boss physically, face-to-face, but now with the check-in, check-out, I hear him, I see him or her at least twice a day, sometimes once a day. So honestly, many people say actually even working from home gives us the ability to connect better. And like Dr. Manzoni said earlier, if you feel that you are connecting more with your people, communicate what you want to communicate. Somebody asked me a question, do you think it's a good time to rebuild the culture or revamp the culture or whatever that is? And I said, why not? If that's the intention of the business or the organization, this is the good time, because now you have the hot boiling platform or hot burning platform to do so. So communicate the right context. And I'm sure like people are really nervous today, really nervous about having their job. So, but I also believe that one of the difference between our financial crisis in 1998 compared to now is in 1998, our economic fundamentals were hit. This crisis, I don't think our economic fundamentals are hit everywhere. I mean, the demand is stuck in the working from home, but I think the demand is still there. To some extent, the capacity to spend is still there. It's just blocked in the working from home. So if that premise is right, when the crisis is over, when this pandemic is over, presumably all the demand will shoot up. Then there can be a new normal where we have to have a new strength, empathy for the new disruption that will come, and also the different way of engaging people. Because what we feel in this, I don't know, probably 8 to 10 weeks working from home, I believe companies have seen a different type of way to engage their people, managing up, managing sideways, and so on. So bear that in mind, that our organization resilience will also be dependent upon the leaders having empathy for what people are feeling, but take this opportunity to communicate the right message, the right values, the right context, and find new ways to maintain the engagement. If you go to the next slide, Panda, I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so with that, let's have a series of Q&A topics. Hand over to Stephane. Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, please keep your questions coming for Sylvano. While I'm waiting for questions, I'd like to point out a few things from the chat that we had before. I will wrap up Fasil's presentation a little bit later. So what we were mentioning is that priorities, and we need to come up with priorities from our leadership perspective, need to have priorities and to be forceful in the implementation, right? So it's the art of saying no 100 times to say yes one time, right? Have intelligence defense, have your top leaders be ready for decision quality decisions, and do not disconnect from the people that are afraid and anxious. Give them psychological safety. So these are the key points that really resonated with me, with us from the IMD talk earlier. Now let's have a look at the questions that we have for Pa Sylvano. Yeah. So what do we have here? So how can we maintain? So Pa Sylvano, you know, there's a good question here. How can we maintain employee engagement or ensure that the employees who are working from home will do their job properly and will just not slack off, right? So up to you, Fasil.
Thank you, Stefan. And to be honest, it is not easy because we are used to monitor and control visually. So if that is the norm that we would like to keep, I think there's no other way than having a constant check-in, check-out, and very constant communication throughout the day. Having said that, I think this new working situation also allows us to filter our talent who are able to work with less supervision and be expected to hold their accountabilities to themselves versus the ones that likes to be, you know, micromanaged, if you like. So I guess there's no easy answer to that, but if we want to have a short answer, then if we have to maintain a visual monitoring of performance, we need to keep that by having a constant check-in, check-out. My suggestion to one of my colleagues is make sure that we respond to our WhatsApp message, tag, call that we are not able to do within 5 minutes. Even if the response say, sorry, I can't talk to you now, I'll talk to you later. But I think people are anxious, bosses are anxious, not knowing what their team are doing. So have empathy to your bosses. You know, respond to them very, very quickly, and I hope that engage the communications better. But don't forget that this crisis allows us to see who are people who will be able to step up compared to the rest. Stefan?
Good, very good. So the next question that we have here, how is a company surviving by reducing headcount and right sizing? Because the company will have to pay for severance pay, meaning cash flow will become more strained. So the key here is that, look, especially in Indonesia, right? This is an Indonesian specific, not just Indonesia, but Indonesia specific challenge. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's like a catch-22 or a simalakama, what we call it. We cut now, we have to spend a hefty retrenchment cost, but at the same time, if you don't do that, I guess at the end of the day, and to be frank, we did it within our organization ourselves globally. It was a very difficult thing to do, you know, in order to cut the cost, but at the same time, we need to spend a lot of retrenchment costs, especially in some jurisdiction. The labor law, the retrenchment law are quite heavy. So companies need to look at their cash flow to do so. One way is to stagger them. Again, I'm not advising retrenchment, but if you have to do that, stagger it. Stagger, because I think it's safe to say a 5% reduction in manpower, perhaps it's not too difficult, assuming that you have ability to pay, right? But if you cannot do all at once, do it in stages. That gives you time or buys you time. And because if you look at the previous data, some people believe that by July, this pandemic will be over and the rebound will probably come as soon as 3 months, which means September. The worst case scenario is people think that this pandemic will end in December with a rebound of 9 months, which means that we will be looking at end of 2021 as the rebound. So I guess it may be different from company to company, but in industry, but stagger them if you can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pa. And another question here that I have, you mentioned in step 3, foundational restructuring. One of it is CapEx cuts, right? How do you select which CapEx to cut in order to do selected offense properly? So which CapEx to cut? That's the question.
Yes, I would use the previous example from Dr. Manzoni. I think you said about IMD. Within IMD, you also had to do some cuts, but you're also investing in technology because you believe, IMD believes that use of technology will be more prominent after the crisis. So that is one example. The other thing is, if you believe that there are new niche of products that you can sell because it was not needed, but it will be needed in the new normal. So maybe research and development or product development to find out what are the new products that you can sell. So I'm not an expert on financial restructuring, but if you use the premise that try to know what our business would look like in the new normal, there is no crystal ball. Nobody knows the future, but at least if we can predict for the next 6 to 9 months, and I've seen some companies actually thinking of new products that was not needed during before the crisis, but now is needed. I hope that. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So we have another question here. What do you think about the office environment, right? Ecosystem, post-COVID, right? You were mentioning, we had a conversation before, Pascal, about this, right? So now that we can do business from home, why have an office, right? Why have an office? So that's a question we need to think about also at Korn Ferry. No kidding. So anyway, so basically, right, the question is, how do we do that? How do we make sure that we have the facilities that we need and not extra?
Well, I think that particular example is appropriate. And that's probably a challenge for our friends at the property business, because if our business is, let's say, down by 30%, and our property costs constitute, let's say, 1/5 of our total operating costs, but with this work from home, even though our business goes down by 30%, but our property cost goes down by, let's say, 70%, give and take, that pushes us to think, like your question, Stephane, do we need all this extra space? Is there something that we can do differently with the extra space if we cannot reduce the space? But certainly the working from home gives us a new way of thinking of that. I had a meeting with the Secretary General of one of the big ministry about a month ago, and they said that they've been having this idea of working remote for the last 2 years. Never worked, never happened. Why? Because our mindset still believe I have to go back to my cubicle, I have my family photo there, and blah, blah. But now the echelons 3 and 4 are forced to take work from home. Are they not performing? I think they still do perform, but at a lesser cost if, let's say, they don't have to occupy that space. So I think it's going to be new questions coming up after this crisis and new challenges for industries because of this. Thank you, Stephane.
Very good, thank you. So I think we're getting close to the end. So I'd like to hand a question. We have a question here with Professor Manzoni. So please, Professor Manzoni, if you could answer the following question. The strategy that you have mentioned about balancing offense and defense is powerful. My question to you is how to play selected offense when the option is not much, but that means there are not that many options to play selected offense. It would be useful if you could provide a concrete example of selected offense. So a question for you, Professor Manzoni.
Let me try to respond quickly. Clearly, there are, again, different opportunities in different industries. I think the key question is, and Sylvano mentioned it also, is how will the post-crisis world be different for you, your organization, and your industry from what it is today. In particular, there's a few things that we know will be different, right? So we know that there will be more technology-mediated interactions. For example, this means there will probably be more working from home. This has implication for people who are in the office rental business. But again, it also creates opportunities on the technology front. So I think this is really a question that starts with, in your industry, given what you do, how will the world be different later on? Will your supply chain look different post-crisis? In all likelihood, we will see a little bit more retrenchment and a little bit of more local sourcing, because it probably increases resilience. So how will your world be affected by this crisis? And how will the competitive conditions differ post-crisis? And again, it starts from your expertise of your industry, right? And this is a conversation that, for example, when we're involved with top management team, we can facilitate. We can also research it, right? So if there is a specific sector, we can research it. But the question that starts or kicks off this reflection is, how will the world look different, and how do you prepare for it? The other one, if you remember, I mentioned two questions, is also, how do I make decisions today in a way that are reinforcing the sense of purpose, the sense of community, and the sense of shared destiny within my organization? So again, even if there are no investments that you can make, even if there's no competitor you can acquire, your question still remains, how do I go through this crisis in a way that leaves my company more aligned, more united, and more engaged? And that, I think, any organization can do.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Manzoni. So we're wrapping up very soon, and we have just a couple of minutes to go. So next slides, please. Okay. So closing remarks from the Korn Ferry perspective, from the Sylvano story right now. So every crisis is different, but there's always new opportunities. There are many crises. Those of us who are old enough, and we're all old enough to know that we've gone through many crises, and it's always the last crisis, right? It's always going to change the entire world. Yes, in a way, but there's always new opportunities. Allow us to clean up our house. This allows us to reach out to our people and say the important things that matters to each of us. Echoing the words of Prof. Manzoni earlier, psychological safety is very important. You know, empathy, psychological safety, essential for our people and our leaders. And it pushes us to think and act more independently and make faster decisions, right? So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for being in attendance. I see that our attendance is very stable, very select members. I think this was the first ever a joint webinar between IMD and Korn Ferry in the world. So you guys are making history today, right? We're all making history today, and the participants are already making history. So thank you very much. With that, we'd like to have the next slide, which is we're inviting your feedback. So there's going to be a poll, some evaluation form that will pop up after this webinar. Please stay around and finish the evaluation. Again, thank you very much, and we're going to see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.